All right. So it's 5 past the hour, so let's get going. Hi everybody, and thanks for joining Craft's webinar series. Today I'm extremely excited to host with me Adnan Khan from Travelex.
Hey everyone,
Hi Adnan, how are you?
good. How are you?
I am not bad at all. And today we have quite an interesting topic, somewhat what I would define as kind of like a soft skills topic rather than hard skills from a product management perspective, but still very interesting and very important for people's career management and also basically skills progression. We named it the Elastic PM, so kind of like the thinking about this balancing act of all the different hats and different roles that the product managers should wear. The way this is going to work, I mean, basically, it's going to be a very open conversation, and we're going to share a few of our frameworks around how to think about product management from the different hats that they need to wear, and then towards the end, we'll ask everybody to participate and give their top tips in terms of context switching. We'll explain that in a minute, but we'll like to ask everybody to participate through the kind of Q&A. So, and after that, we can collect all that and share it with everybody. So I think that would be a nice, valuable thing for everybody to have. So with that in mind, let's kick off. I'm going to share my screen now. I hope everybody can see this. I assume everybody can see this. Adnan, why don't you give us just a couple of minutes about yourself, just in terms of your background, before we kind of kick it off officially. Just share a little bit about your career as a product manager so far.
Sure. I work with Travelex right now. I'm part of a team called Tax-Free Shopping, and I'm a product manager with the team with this typical product manager roles, which obviously we'll get into more detail of in a bit. But before Travelex, I was the head of product for a startup, which was in a very sort of different industry, which used to make tools and a sort of platform for the film industry. And before that, I had sort of a bit of a consulting background, some product management, some sort of tech consulting. I was with KPMG. Education-wise, I had a sort of bachelor's in computer science, so I have kind of a coding background, but then I sort of did an MBA, did a sort of little startup of my own, and then sort of eventually came back towards the sort of corporate world.
Right. So speaking of elasticity, so you've done both like technical and business, and you've done small, and Travelex, which is obviously a very large company.
Exactly. Yes.
Got it. And you're based out of the UK, just for sharing with people, right? So
yes, we're based in London.
Cool. So thanks a little bit thanks for that. So I'm gonna kick off with, I think, something that is quite obvious, which is why do product teams exist? And I think eventually, and this is true, I think for all product managers that I know, and probably for everybody on the call as well, on the Zoom link as well. I mean, eventually, product teams exist in order to create products and services that people will love and use, and that's kind of like the end game. And I think that this declaration or statement kind of contains both sides of the equation of eventually both thinking about a product, so as in something that you build, but also something that there's a customer or a consumer on the other side, and that kind of will kind of bring us slowly into what the different hats we want to wear, because eventually product managers need to think about all the different angles, not just about the software, but also about the people and the users of the product. I want to start by introducing this. So this is just very broadly, this is kind of like a framework that we try to create here at Craft that try to captures everything that is done by product. Of course, we haven't captured everything. There's a lot of other items that are probably missing. We'll try to capture the main things. And through that framework, I hope you see it reasonably okay. I mean, like you kind of like start with the dark red into the light red and also to the kind of like to the pink, It's like there's basically this process of moving from the strategy, like the 30,000 feet view of product, which is strategy, the road mapping, etc., into what I would say prioritization, what we call here like the 10,000 feet, which is like prioritizing features or epics, dependencies, and like really properly defining the features, and then moving into execution, which is basically where you take a feature or an epic and like break it down into the user stories, into the specs, and really actually go into sprint planning, depending, of course, you work on Agile or not, and really going into the actual development. That's kind of like a very broad overview of how we think about product and how we also tackle things in craft. And what comes across from this, I think, and Adnan, feel free to jump in, of course, is it's a very broad. I mean, you call this profession product management, but it's an extremely broad job, basically. And actually, it's a lot of different jobs, right?
Absolutely. I think it's one of those fields which is obviously pretty new, right? So the definition of it is pretty elastic, which means every other person you talk to has a different notion of what a product manager is supposed to do or what you're all about. But it's essentially literally all of these things.
Yeah, and for that, thanks for that perspective. And I think the one thing that I have noticed, I don't know what you think about it, this might be a little bit of a controversial statement to make. What I see in a lot of product managers, especially when they're starting their journey as product managers, is they're very, very focused in the execution part, which I also like to call the solution part. So kind of like really building the product, right? So the actual kind of like from specs to actual sprint planning and building. Do you agree with that statement?
I actually do agree. Yes, absolutely. So I think, and we were sort of having a little conversation about this earlier, it feels like the sort of whole discipline of product management has been hijacked by Scrum or Agile. And what I mean by that is it feels like, and everyone's expectations of you as a product manager is like you're in service of the development team to come up with specs and sprint plans. And while that is a really important part of what you do, that is literally just the tip of the iceberg, right? I would say, though, early on in your career, it's really important to go through that journey, though, right? I mean, because if you understand execution and if you understand the sort of tactical parts of it, only then can you be sort of a little more effective when you move towards the strategic part of this role.
Yeah, no, I completely agree with you. But I mean, to your point, I think eventually, and this is one of the things that you see, I mean, craft feels the same, and I suspect almost everybody on the call feels the same, because you have this development arm, and that development arm demands, quote unquote, like build, like something to build. Yeah. You end up always chasing your sprints in a way, right? So, which I think pushes a lot of people into execution, but forgets about, things, mundane things like customers and what do they actually need and how to think about the problem before actually going and building things.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you go through this sort of mental cycle, right? The moment a sprint has been planned and we've had the sort of sprint planning meeting, etc., the product team is like, okay, fine. Now we can think about the important stuff, right? And then before you know it, the next sprint looms large, and then you have to sort of think about that. So I mean, that's a constant struggle, a constant sort of cycle.
Yeah, no, I agree. One of the things that I think, and I saw that, I mean, I worked with Google and at Taboola before joining Kraft as a CEO. And one of the things you see in like eventually in the leadership of product, and this is a very common trait I've seen across most of the organization also that are customers of Kraft, you see that eventually the leaders are actually trying to move away from that space, not because it's not important, just because the brilliance or it starts with understanding fully the user problem and understanding a North Star and how does that link to the user problem, and only then going into the execution. So really spending more time in the 30,000 feet and the 10,000 feet, even though the 1,000 feet is very demanding and always asking for you as a product manager.
Yeah, true. And this, it isn't to say that, one of these is better than the others, right? I mean, both are extremely important, right? So it's not that, the strategic thinking part is superior to the sort of tactical thing. They're both equally important. Without one or the other, you can't really function. But both are really demanding and both require a lot of your brain space and your time. So you have to sort of prioritize.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. I for sure not to say one is more important than the other. I think at the moment, if there's an outcry, that's a bit dramatic, but if there's an outcry I would make to the industry is like, I think the industry is very solution oriented, and it's probably time to move away a little bit further and like thinking more about the strategy and like why are you trying to build, and for who are you trying to build,
Absolutely.
rather than execution. And there's been an interesting, actually, I saw an interesting research done recently that stated about 80% of the features developed are actually not used. It's like
Yeah.
like tens of billions of dollars just in SaaS, like tens of billions of dollars of execution of delivery, development effort going to basically stuff that nobody needs. So it's like kind of a bit of an indication. But anyway,
Exactly.
we're digressing a little bit. So I think from my perspective, the key thing is that, to your point, is that product managers kind of need to be able to do all of this, right? So they need to be able to do both. Obviously, the execution. You mentioned you think this is good early on in your career to start like more like in the product owner space, like really in the sprint planning to understand the dev first.
Yeah, I think it's really important. I think it helps a lot. I mean, eventually you have to try and shed some of that sort of mindset once you sort of start moving away from this.
Yeah.
But starting from there just gives you a very good knowledge of how things are actually executed, what's possible and what's not, and how to make those trade-offs.
I see. That makes sense. And I think also you probably learn a little bit about what's feasible and what's not feasible, and at what time frames are feasible, right? So it's like to get a bit of a sense of that as well. Like kind of in terms of like cool.
Yeah.
And so I think and kind of related to that, that's what kind of I want to dive into next. Related to this framework, which is kind of like talking through from strategy all the way to execution, is the actual persona, or I would say the tendency of each product manager in terms of what they are excited about when they're thinking about product, right? So the sense that eventually people come to this discipline, and you mentioned this earlier at the beginning of this webinar, people come to the discipline from everywhere. I mean, they come from development, they come from marketing, they come from different, I saw a lot of people come from general engineering backgrounds, and it's one of those areas, because it's not very well defined, that you get a lot of different personas like trying to do all of this, right?
Yeah.
And so what we try to do in the next couple of slides, in a couple of minutes, is basically kind of articulating all these types of persona and how they fit into this framework of strategy versus execution, and kind of loosely fitting, I would say, and then trying to understand a little bit, why is it important that you as a product manager have those skills, or at least think about those skills, and also why it's important when you're building a team of product managers. And I suspect a lot of the people on the call are people who are team leads or aspiring to be managing a product team on their own. Why is it important to have a very well-versed team in terms of the different skill sets, rather than having a specific skill as a core, which is a bias that you can always fall into, because you tend to hire people that similar to you in many ways, right? So it's kind of like important, I think, for product to think actually, what are my missing skills? What are my gaps? What are the things that I need to hire into my team in order to have a more well-rounded team? If that makes sense. So let's dive into that, and let's start with like the personas that we've kind of articulated here. So this is kind of our attempt to try to show the different types of product managers that we've come across, and so you, Adnan, yourself, and also myself, in the time that we've been working in this space. So we'll start with the product strategist, which is clearly articulated here by Jim Carrey, typing frantically. And then tell us a little bit about that type. So in terms of like, what does that mean to be the strategy guy within a team, or what does it mean to focus on the strategy?
Yes, I mean, I think it's really important for us to understand that product management does not exist in a vacuum, right? We operate in a business environment, or in some cases in a sort of non-business non-profit environments, right? But in any case, when we are trying to deliver solution to our customers or our users, we should know that we're not the only ones doing that, right? And also, we need to understand that especially if you're a product manager for a business, that business has a business model, and it's got a revenue model, and it's got sort of profitability and cash flows, right, to run. So we need to come up with a plan, right, that on one side meets the business needs of their sort of revenues or profits or whatever have you, and on the other side, it's a sort of sustainable plan to keep competition at bay for a length of time, right? And what that means is that we need to have an instinctive understanding of the market in which we operate, right? A good understanding of the business model that we have. And a lot of times the market that we operate in kind of dictates the business model. And that dictates our choices that go onto a roadmap, right? So I'll give you an example, right? So if you are in sort of in a business where the revenue model is around transactions, right? Say, for example, the kind of business that we are in, which is the sort of VAT refund space, we sort of tend to make money off of the number of transactions that a customer would make on our platform, right? What this means is, as a product strategy, we need to optimize the sort of metric that we are after is basically conversion, right? On the other hand, a SaaS business like Craft, say, for example, right, is potentially around retention more than conversion, right? So we need to understand all these sort of forces in play, which will have an impact on what features we use, how our roadmap will be shaped. Does that kind of make sense?
Yeah, it makes perfect sense. And I think, I mean, the strategy piece is like, it's one of those things that is very elusive. And, you know, I've seen a lot of companies, you know, they do the strategy once a year and then they like end up with a few themes and then it's just like moving on with your day to day, right? So I like to think of strategy, and this is kind of also, I've seen it in other companies, both at Google and even here at Craft. I mean, I think of strategy as the one, like whenever you need context, like very high level context. Like, what are you trying to achieve? And does this thing eventually serves your direction? It's very important to have that in front of you. And I think the product team that doesn't have a North Star and like something that is aiming towards, and also product team that doesn't understand or looks at that is is in a really problematic shape. And I think every product manager has to have that context. Now, it's true that, you know, when you think of like a specific user story and a specific feature, you know, you don't always think about that. But this context is critical for honestly at all stages of product management across the entire spectrum, all the way from strategy into execution. So I really think that, and this is something I see a lot of young people when they start, they're not strategy, this level of strategy is kind of, it's very elusive to them. Do you have any sense in terms of how to, like, how do you see people in your team kind of like connecting to the strategy? Is this something that you guys do, I don't know, once a quarter, you kind of like refresh it and look at it? Or how do you make sure that everybody's like connected to the strategy more?
Yeah, that's the communication challenge is always a big one, right? And especially if you're in an environment where some outside forces keep on changing really quickly, and then you have to sort of either sort of pivot or sort of change your strategy a bit. We do have sort of quarterly planning meetings, but sometimes what we come out with in those meetings tends to change. So we make sure that we have sort of fortnightly strategy kind of updates for the entire team. We tell them if anything has changed, why, and what that is. Right?
So you kind of have like a touch base in calendar that says like, okay, we have a strategy, but let's think about it for a second. Has something changed so that we can kind of adapt ourselves?
Exactly. Yes.
That's quite cool. Sounds good. All right, moving on to the next. By the way, for those who don't know why I removed Jim Carrey was just driving me crazy a little bit, so I removed it. So I hope it's okay. It was a bit too hectic for a strategy. And let's move on to the next persona, which is the customer obsessor. So, I mean, this for me, I mean, this is the one I'm very close to my heart personally, because I've grown up in the go-to-market space. So I've grown up in in marketing and in customer success throughout my career. And I mean, for me, that's where the problems start, as in the problem of the user. It's always where you want to start with before writing, not even a line of code, but before writing even a spec or even mock something. So tell us a little bit about that personality, if that's okay.
Yes, I think, I mean, one, it's a very different kind of mindset, right? So whereas what we just discussed as the strategy mindset is more sort of analytical and more sort of deep rooted in these sort of ideas of economics, etc. And this one is a lot more emotional. Not to say that it's sort of touchy feely, but it's
Never. We would never say that about product managers.
absolutely not, right? Or about UX. I mean, the way I think about this is, right, in very sort of common sense terms, there's a lot of literature out there around how to be customer obsessed and all kinds of tools and techniques, right? But what it boils down to, in my view, is your real instinctive common sense understanding of the customer, right?
Yeah.
So what I compare this to is, I mean, I've got two girls, two daughters, and so when I'm trying to sort of think of their birthday present, right? If I have to go and ask them, right, it means I don't quite know them, right? And so instinctive understanding of them should lead me to find the right present for them, right? And that's the kind of understanding that you need for a customer, right? You need to really know them, right? It's not about just interviews or your techniques and things of that sort. You actually need to develop an instinctive understanding, right? Which comes with spending enough time thinking about them, observing them, talking to them, reading about them, all those things, right? So all those techniques help us, but that sort of instinctive knowledge about whether they would love this or not like this, developing that is just key, right?
That's very cool, and that's a very cool example. You said you're not going to be emotional, and then you gave examples of your daughter. So you've killed it. But I'll say my angle to this, and I mean, we just actually we just went through a very interesting process in Craft of actually trying to think of our product in the jobs to be done framework. I mean, we're not going to dwell into this framework. I find it to be very, very interesting as a framework, especially in B2B, actually, to help think about how to be more customer obsessed. But I have to tell you, I have an anecdote to share, which I spent a couple of hours with a friend of mine who's a VP product in a quite large company, and I spoke to him about the challenges that he had in terms of understanding why things don't get adopted, like why features don't get adopted.
Yeah.
And I asked him whether his product team is like talking to the customers. He said, yeah, of course they went and they shared the feature, and everybody was very excited about that. And I told him, you should send your product managers to basically pretend that they're salespeople and go sell it instead of going. And this is one of the things in my mind that a lot of product, I don't know how you feel about it. Whenever a product manager comes into a room and talks to a customer, they are immediately like a little bit kind of like excited and a little bit, it's a little bit like meeting a celebrity, right? So in some sense, because it's like the guy who builds the product, and that's very, very cool. They won't tell you, for various reasons, they won't tell you actually what they feel. I really think that actually looking at like obsessing in different ways, for example, going and selling, like literally pretending to be a salesperson and going and selling, not presenting yourself as a product manager, or looking at recordings or listening to recordings of customer conversation is very, very important for product managers. Like critical because otherwise you can't actually see. I mean, to the point you mentioned about your daughters, you need to see them in situ, really in their natural habitat, rather than like completely distort the conversation by talking to them. In some ways, I find the PM interview in many ways like a distortion of how customers actually behave. I don't know what you feel about that.
I think that's absolutely true. I mean, it's a very tricky problem, right? I mean, you can't ask the customer what they feel. I mean, because what they say is not what they feel, right? That's almost always the case. And there's so many sort of biases that come into play, especially if they're in an environment where they know they're being sort of asked a question, etc., for a particular purpose. They always feel sort of very polite about their responses. They can't tell you, that your idea absolutely sucks. So just asking them specific questions never works. I mean, one of the things that does work for us is rather than asking, having specific questions for them, having open-ended conversations with them, right? And very sort of exploratory conversations with them, which may or may not lead to an insight, but most often than not, it does. Um, um, the second thing is, as you said, trying to sort of observe them in their natural environment. And it's just tricky it varies from the industry to industry that you're in. So for example, in our industry, our customers are tourists, right? And their natural habitat is the retail space in which they go to buy stuff, and the airports. So we tend to spend a lot of time at the airports trying to just see what people are doing.
So you go to an airport, but you don't fly, right? So that's pretty frustrating.
No, exactly. It's a very weird feeling, though. I mean, a lot of times we're at the airport not flying out.
I see. So actually, you're actually going to the space where they're at, and like seeing how they behave. Like I know you guys do like VAT kind of. That was recent product you launched, right? So the VAT refund. Cool.
Yeah.
All right, moving on. Just conscious of a bit of time. Let's talk a little bit about this guy, the commercial geek. So So I mean, for me, that's like the obvious kind of persona, as in like eventually, if a product doesn't sell, and commercial doesn't mean necessarily sell with money. It could be sell with engagement, but eventually it needs to drive something that eventually helps the business grow from a commercial standpoint, right? So it's like, and you see a lot of people who are, especially I think a lot of the technology-driven people, that are kind of indifferent. I grew up at Google, which is a company that is like always says that money will come later, right? So, but they start always with a user problem, right? So it's like, I think at the very least you need to balance between this type and the customer obsessor, right? So it's like, otherwise you end up just building technology that you can rather than technology that people need.
Exactly. Absolutely. I mean, in the end, I mean, as I said before, it's usually a business that you're working for, right? And the numbers need to work, right? So you need to have an understanding of, for example, what is our price point? What is the value proposition as a whole, not just as a sort of solution for the user problem, but also are we asking them for £100 a month for a user, or are we asking them for a sort of transaction cost, which is way too high for them? And is that in line with what the competition is doing, right? So again, we don't operate in a vacuum. We operate under all those sort of commercial forces that define, to a large extent, how we can do things, right? So for example, if you think about a company like, Facebook, etc., their revenue model is around advertising, right? Which dictates a lot of how their product managers would work, right? I mean, they would optimize engagement over anything else, right? And that's just down to the revenue model that they have. So I mean, it's just extremely important to understand this.
No, absolutely. I mean, I'm not going to go into that rabbit hole if it's okay. To talk about Facebook right now is like problematic. Like it's a chat. I mean, obviously great company, but it's I think their product management team's probably like torn between a lot of direction, right? So in many
sure,
areas.
Absolutely.
Right. Moving on to this is, I'm going to let you talk about this guy, the custodian of creative culture, because that's I mean, you kind of mentioned that, and I didn't think about that before, but I think actually it's a very cool type that a product manager has to also think about.
Sure. Yeah. So I think, if you think about what creativity is, the general notion that you have is around, aesthetics or design and things that sort, but it's really about sort of looking at problems creatively, looking at the sort of world with a creative lens, and finding problems that you wouldn't otherwise see, or finding solutions that you would otherwise see, right? And the trouble is that in our sort of organizations, mostly it feels like, that particular role has been given to the UX team, and, they've been sort of given the responsibility of go ahead and go, do your creative stuff and then come back with ideas, etc. Whereas the real sort of solutions actually come out of this collaboration and this sort of conversational space between different teams and between different disciplines, right? So it's kind of a cliche that at the intersection of sort of technology and art and design and humanities, that's where sort of magic happens. But that's so true, right? I mean, when you let those conversations flow, and you have an early idea, anyone could have that early idea. That needs protection, and that needs sort of space to sort of simmer and brew, right? And that can only happen if you have a culture that protects the spirit of creativity, right? Which says, okay, guys, anyone can come up with an idea, and we can have a conversation, and it will be iterative. It will sort of take weeks for us to create something meaningful out of that, but that doesn't mean we should not come up with ideas, right? Or developers should not come up with sort of problems or solutions, or
Yeah, I love that approach. To be honest, I think you mentioned right. I mean, I think the word creativity immediately sparks to mind. The design, like the UX, UI design kind of aspects of the product team. But what you're basically saying is that creativity, it's kind of like a misnomer in that sense. It's like it's everywhere, and it's like
Yeah,
coming out either with a great definition of what the user problem is, or coming up with a great solution is not just for that UX or UI, or of course could be also, but not just for those. And actually, you should cultivate a culture, and you also for yourself you need to adopt that kind of mentality of like saying, okay, I need to also kind of expand my thinking about things, right?
yeah, exactly. And it's like the product managers are not the custodians of ideas. We don't have to be the ones always generating ideas. I mean, best ideas could come from literally anywhere in the organization.
Yeah, and I think I mean that's probably one of the problems that a lot of product managers face, because I think they try to crack it. You know what I mean? Like to try, and I don't think, I mean, eventually good product management is trying to understand, in my mind, is like trying to understand problems and build an environment that cracks it, rather than always be the guy or the lady who cracks it, right? So all right,
Exactly.
moving
Otherwise,
on.
you will bottleneck, right?
Yeah. Just conscious of time, just kind of like jumping ahead. So we spoke about UX. So you're saying also it's not just UX that needs to be advocate of UX, right? So you're saying basically it's about everybody needs to think about user experience.
Yes, exactly. I mean, so this in my view is slightly different from sort of the general idea of creativity, right? I mean, this is putting the user first as a team, right? It's not about developers saying, guys, having a scalable platform, we should do that first before we shell out features, and product team saying, no, guys, we need features first. It's like, all of us are in this together, and we have one single goal, which is to delight our users, right? So let's figure out how to do that, right? And the user experience trumps everything else. Obviously, we should know what the constraints are, right? What's feasible, what's not, but we should all be singing off the same hymn sheet, right?
Yeah, that's very clear and very, very true. And then let's go fast into the last two. So project manager and prioritizer. I mean, for me, that's one of those things that it's I like this meme. For me, it's one of those things where it's sometimes frowned upon, but eventually I think it's, we all have to remember that great product managers are also people who actually get things done. Yeah. Right. So it's really about deciding what to do next, and really just just like making sure that things get executed, whether it's from the roadmap level and all the way down to actual sprint planning and all that, right? So
yeah, true. I mean, obviously, this is the part of product management that gets most of the sort of attention in your sort of blog sphere and books, etc. And rightly so, it is really important. But this is just one part of the overall picture, right? So without this, you won't get anything executed, right? But if you're doing just this and you're doing nothing else, then you're not really sort of doing your whole job either.
Yeah, that's very, very true. And then last but not least is the executor and techie. So really kind of like masters of the solution, the people who are, deep, knee-high into the development efforts and in the backlogs and in the sprints and the bugs and the stories and tasks and the issues, are really deep into that. And that's of course critical. I mean, in my mind, that's, a PM is, as you mentioned earlier, it's very hard for a PM not to be able to do that, because then they want to understand what is feasible, what is not feasible, what time frame, and also how to push a development team in a positive way, to push the development team to the right solution in the right time.
Yeah, exactly. And I mean, it's really important. And one of the things that PMs struggle with a lot of times is getting the respect of the developers, right? And this is what ActionSet gets it. I mean, if you know what you're talking about, people sort of tend to respect you. um, yeah.
Yeah, no, that makes perfect sense. I think in my mind, as you mentioned, this is like table stakes for product managers. It's not something you can live without. But it is something that if you don't, if you dwell too deep into, you end up forgetting why you're building the solution. And that's kind of like what, like just to close the loop of what we tried to articulate at the beginning of this conversation and webinar. It really is about finding the balance between all these different aspects and angles of product management and balancing everything out. And to finish off, I'd like to open it up for everybody on the webinar, and we're going to talk about our tips and tricks, but I would love it if possible, if people just share with us. I mean, there's a Q&A button and people can just log their thoughts there. So the question I have for everybody, I know it's kind of like the opposite of how Q&A should work. It really is about just if anybody can share their tips about to do switches between the different states of product management. I'll let you start. I have my own tips, but I'll let you start, Adnan. If you can give me your, what I don't know, one or two top tips in terms of how to do like context switching, right?
Yeah. For me, one of the things that really works is actually changing the physical space in which you operate, right? So the moment I'm sort of going to the office, I tend to start becoming very tactical, right? Because I know, we're sitting with developers and there's sort of stuff that'll come out. So every now and then, I try to sort of move out of that space. So I work from home once a week, right? That helps me sort of think about uninterrupted, sort of thinking about this sort of bigger picture. Or I work out of a coffee shop for a couple of hours a day, no access to Slack, no access to my PC at times, just so that I can switch off and think about some other things.
So you're saying location. So location for you is like location and
location for me is big, and then sort of a break between these sort of different mindsets. Sometimes I'll just go for a really short walk, just to clear my head and say, okay, so I've been thinking about this, and I have to switch context and think about something else, but I need that sort of breathing space in between. Right?
I see. That's quite helpful. I'll share my tips. So in the meantime, for those who are on the webinar, if you want to share your thoughts about how to switch between the different states, so please just throw it into the Q&A. You can also email us afterwards and share with us your thoughts on that. But for me, I mean, the key thing from switching is a tip, kind of like a trick I learned by being a father. So when you're a father, you see that kids actually need time for context switching. It's just you just see it physically because they have to have at least. So if you want to take your kids from activity 1 to activity 2, like you're at the playground and you want to go to have lunch, you need to take at least, I would say, 15, 20 minutes in advance.
Yeah, that's so
to just allow the brain to go through this notion of like context switching. And this kind of like stuck in my mind very clearly. But for me, what I do is I try to make sure that I look at my calendar, and when I manage my calendar, I make sure that I don't have really context switching meetings like adjacent to each other. And I try very hard not to, I mean, sometimes, you're a CEO and you kind of have to, but you really try to force it so that you are moving, so you're like, you have at least, 15, 20, sometimes 30 minutes, so that you don't go into let's say a creative thinking, like a solution oriented discussion after you've had like a very detailed kind of like tactical discussion. Like, you really want to like be able to have time to just clear your head. And especially when you work in larger companies, people just run between meetings, right? So, and it's very hard to do that context switching when you don't have like time to breathe and sometimes time to pee. So I really urge people to manage their calendar in a smart way and look at the meetings. Not only like do you have enough time to get from point A to point B, but also do you have enough time to switch context? So that's kind of my tip for.
That's really useful, actually.
So I have so as I mentioned, we're opening up the Q&A for 2 reasons, right? So first of all, of course, ask questions. We're kind of running out of time, but there was a question that came up from somebody from the audience. You did hint to the possibility of customers not being very forthcoming with information as regards with business challenges. How possible is this? Sorry, I work in engineering. So first of all, no need to apologize. Everybody's accepted here. And in terms of, so I mean, Adnan, do you want to take this one?
I'm not sure if I understand this sort of question well enough. So is it, do you mean to ask how possible is it for us to actually get to know what they actually feel? Or
yeah, I think it's in that context, like how you know.
Yeah.
Sorry. So there's a clarification. When he's saying when they actually meet product managers, so they're not very forthcoming, right? So that's the thing.
Yeah. So I mean, as I said earlier, usually what I do is I have sort of long conversations with them, which are open ended, right? Which means I'm not sort of asking them very sort of direct questions around, is this a problem that you face? Yes or no, right? It's more around sort of context about their lives, and that reveals so much more about the problem space than asking directly questions. So that's one of the sort of techniques that I use. Eli,
I can if I can follow up on that technique, I would say always ask the next why. It's like in my head, that's just like a very basic tip. Like people give you an answer and then you say why, and then just leave it open, and people immediately come up with something else, and you start digging into the layers of the actual underlying reasoning rather than the surface. I think a lot of cases, people ask questions because they want to hear what they want to hear. You know, I've seen that with many product managers. They want to ask something because they want to hear the answer that they thought about. And the key is to never stop asking, just continuously ask. All right, another question, and I think we'll conclude at that. What is your opinion on specifying very clearly what responsibilities are on the PM and what is on the team? And before coming to that conclusion, also discuss it in the team, involve comments from the team before deciding. Often responsibilities are coming from above and is already connected to the role of the PM. This one is it's a very interesting one. So I'll say my very obvious, like kind of maybe obvious, but like I'll state I think eventually empowerment for product is critical. I know it sounds a little bit like fluffy. Product managers in today's world are mini CEOs of their product. I know some people can kind of think of it as maybe a little bit cheesy, but it is reality. And I just strongly urge you to just feel that, and like really, it is on the PM and each and every PM to be the custodian of decision making and deciding what to do next. I do agree, of course, that when there's a context of a team, it's very hard to kind of like balance it. But eventually, every PM is very independent, and I've seen that in software companies that we work with. They're extremely independent people. They get to decide on a lot of things in a relatively not very confined environment of decision making. I don't know how you feel about that, Adnan.
Yeah, I completely agree. I mean, in terms of the definition of the role, I think it helps if the role is kind of defined, right? But it really differs from company to company to sort of size of the company and so forth, right? So in small startups, PMs would literally be doing all of the stuff that we've just discussed on a day-to-day basis without any help, right? What really helps is if the overall team and sort of the management of the company understand that you can't have a single PM and you're working on sort of 10 different products or many products, right? This discipline needs help as well, right? Which means, having sort of some hierarchies within or some division of sort of labor within the PM team or product team helps a lot as well. So having a product owners and then product managers and
makes sense. The kind of division of labor, etc. Makes all right. We're kind of like out of time, so I'd like at this stage just to say a big thanks to you, Adnan. Really appreciate your time and your perspective. It's been very interesting and very revealing, and of course for everybody in the audience, thanks a lot for joining us.
Thank you. Likewise.
And I will, if that's okay, we'll stop here. And if anybody has any follow-up questions or they want to get more in depth into one of the topics, please feel free to share over email, and we can follow up afterwards with Adnan or with myself. All right. Thanks, everybody. Thank you.